Welcome to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. This museum tells the story of the American experience in World War II, why it was fought, how it was won, and what it means today. Thank you so much to the thousands of students joining us today to learn about Japanese-American experiences during World War II. I'm Scott Fujita, your host for this electronic field trip. You may know me as a former NFL linebacker for the New Orleans Saints. However, you may not know that my father was born in the Gila River incarceration camp and my grandfather served in World War II. I'm so excited to welcome all the classrooms tuning in right now, including many of my students at All Saints Day School in Carmel, California. Join me and student reporters Rio and Cavell as we take your classroom on a journey to gather the stories of Japanese Americans who are forcibly removed from the West Coast after the United States entrance into World War II. ASL interpretation and English captioning are available for this webcast. Q&A is now open on the Vimeo player for you to ask questions. You can also ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag JAEFT. Our expert, Aaron Aoyama, and museum educators are standing by to answer your questions. Next, we'll meet student reporter Rio and his grandmother, Dr. Amy Iwasaki Mass, to explore wartime experiences of Japanese Americans through their own connection to Hart Mountain Incarceration Camp. We'll also meet Cavell and museum educator Colin Makehamson to discuss the museum's artifacts and share Walter Imahara's experiences at the Jerome and Rower camps. But first, here's the opening poll question. How many states had incarceration camps? 3, 7, 8, or 5? Vote now and we'll reveal the answer when we return. Take it away, Rio and Cavell.
Hello, my name is Rio and I go to school in Albany, California. I'm here with my grandmother Amy to talk about the Japanese American experience during World War II. My grandmother was incarcerated at Hart Mountain Camp in Wyoming. After the war, she taught and researched the psychological impact of incarceration as a clinical social worker and Whittier College professor. Her experiences and research were the basis of her powerful 1981 testimony in Los Angeles. To better understand her story, let's step back into history. In the 1880s, Issei immigrated to the Kingdom of Hawaii and worked on fruit and sugar plantations owned by U.S. companies. They toiled in the fields and lived in unsanitary company housing. Forced to follow company policies at all times, they were fined or whipped by the plantation's white overseers for minor offenses like talking, smoking, or stretching on the job. Many left for work in agriculture, produce, lumber, fishing, canneries, and the railroad in the U.S. But despite working hard in their adopted country, they faced racism and competition from white farmers, barring them from American citizenship. The 1913 Alien Land Law prevented immigrants from owning or leasing agricultural land in California. But the Issei circumvented it by using middlemen or their children's names to buy land. What was it like for your parents when they came to the United States?
When my father came, he was 16 years old, and that was back in 1908. And he came, I think, probably like as an adventure as a 16-year-old because he had a relative who was in America. But I think he really liked it because he stayed for 10 years. And then he went back to Japan to this fishing village where he grew up. And he married my mother and brought her to the United States. And so they came to Seattle and raised their family there.
What was your neighborhood like? Were there any community activities or groups your family was a part of?
Yes. I was raised in the area that is referred to as East Hollywood. I wanted to tell you a little bit more too about our Japanese community because it really had quite a few things going for it. We had 2 grocery stores that were Japanese. We had a judo gymnasium. We had a Japanese school, which was also a cultural center.
Hello, my name is Cavell, and I'm currently in the studio at my school outside of New Orleans, Louisiana. Joining me at the museum's United but Unequal, I am an American gallery, and museum educator Colin Makehamson. Can you tell us more about the gallery you're in?
The gallery that I'm in now is part of the Arsenal of Democracy, the George and Herman R. Brown Salute to the Home Front. And this gallery and others that make up this permanent exhibit tell the story of the American experience on the home front, from the road to war, and then how hundreds of millions of Americans who weren't all fighting on the battlefront were supporting our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine on the home front. The gallery that I'm in specifically tells the tragic story of how 110,000 Americans became viewed with contempt, fear, and suspicion, namely Japanese Americans and people of Japanese American descent living on the American West Coast. In this gallery, we see artifacts, we hear oral histories, and we learn about the experiences of American citizens who were uprooted from their homes on the American West Coast, taken to one of 10 incarceration centers in the American interior, and then how they rebuilt their lives at the end of World War II.
I'm looking forward to delving into those stories. First, let's learn about Walter Imahara's family origins in Japan and California. As a boy, Walter grew up in California and was incarcerated at the Jerome and Royer camps in Arkansas. At the camp, his family moved to Louisiana and founded James Gardening Service, which became Imahara's landscape company in Baton Rouge.
I'd like to start off with my grandfather here, Munizo Imahara, okay, first generation, and he's born in the 1850s, and about 1895, his parents said, why don't you go to America, because you were trained as a samurai in these 5 arts of self-defense, okay? Look way at the bottom, jiu-jitsu, karate, okay? You could see that he was trained, but his parents says the days are gone, so he came to America 1895, okay? And he came and ended up in Watsonville, California, but he was a single man, so he got his parents to find him a mate, and she came, and they got married, and the firstborn is my father, James M. Imahara.
Born in Watsonville, California, James Imahara bought 60 acres of farmland for his family in Florida when he was 20 years old. They lived in a 2-story farmhouse, raised poultry, and grew strawberries, grapes, and fruit trees. When he married Haruka Sanada in 1927, they started their new life together on the farm. 20 years in the making, their family farm and American dream disappeared when Pearl Harbor flooded the airwaves in 1941.
Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities.
Just before the war started in 1941, I was a child, 3, 4, 5 years old, and I could remember my grandparents. They're living with my father at the farm in Sacramento, okay, and it was kind of nice, good way, because he did pass away before the war. For him to go into camp, it would have been tragic on my grandmother.
We've learned so much from Rio, Amy, Cavell, and Colin about how the Japanese settled in the United States. Now let's reveal the answer to our first poll question. The first question was, how many states had incarceration camps? 3, 7, 8, or 5? The answer is B. There were 10 camps in 7 states: Arkansas, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. As we'll learn in the next segment, all people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast and parts of Arizona were forced out of their homes shortly after the start of World War II. They initially were taken to temporary assembly centers and eventually to 10 major incarceration camps that were spread out throughout the American West and the South. Now, I am excited to introduce Erin Aoyama, who will be answering some of your questions today and providing some expert insight. Erin is currently studying for her doctorate at Brown University on this topic. Her family was also incarcerated at Hart Mountain, and her grandfather served during the war. Erin, welcome to the show, and we're going to welcome you by going straight to some student questions. Are you ready?
Sounds great. Let's get into it.
Hi, my name is Jackson. I am from Fayette Central, Connersville, Indiana. And my question is, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor?
Thanks for that question, Jackson. That's a good one. The probably most significant answer for what we're talking about today is that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from having a huge impact in World War II, which we know is not what actually happened. But behind that story are also decades of tension between the United States and Japan, going back really to the early 20th century and even before. But in particular, as Japan began to expand across Asia, the United States put embargoes in place, so prevented trade of oil and other important goods, which led to this sort of rising tension between the two nations that ultimately led to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Great question, Jackson. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I was wondering how the government got away with putting people in imprisonment camps without any proof that they were guilty of being untrustworthy. That just doesn't seem fair.
Exactly. It's a great point and a great observation, which I think is why it's so important to tell stories like this. It's important to understand our nation's history, warts and all. On the surface, here we are in 2021, and it's shocking to hear that this took place. But if you really look at and understand our nation's history, perhaps it's not all that surprising, right? So that's why it's important to look back and recognize that warts and all certainly celebrated this country's accomplishments and all the great triumphs, but also recognizing some of the areas where perhaps we have fallen short. So that's a great observation.
Absolutely. And I think thinking about what can happen when you're afraid of another group of people, particularly in times of war, when people were really scared for their lives, for their homes, for their families. But there was a group of people that was easy to target, easy to say they're different from us, they look different, they have different religions, they eat different kinds of food, and that led to this victimization that we'll learn more about today. But absolutely, that's a great question. Thank you for getting us started on it, and I hope we'll continue to think about it as we keep going.
All right, Aaron, we have one more question from Melinda. She wants to know if kids came to camp without parents.
That's a great question. So for the most part, kids came to camp with their parents. There were some cases of, as there are, today, children who didn't have parents, whose parents had passed away or other circumstances had led to them living in orphanages or things like that. And so those children were mostly sent to Manzanar, which was one of the camps in California where there was a children's village, so an orphanage basically, where volunteers and other Japanese Americans took care of these children. But that's part of the case. All Japanese Americans, all people of Japanese ancestry living in the West Coast were sent to camp, whether they were parts of families or not.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you, students. Now, our next segment begins with United States entrance into World War II after the surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. Aaron, why is the attack on Pearl Harbor so important to our story today?
So the attack on Pearl Harbor is important because while it's not the start of our story, as you heard Rio talk about with his grandmother, there's a history of Japanese Americans and this sort of anti-Japanese sentiment well before Pearl Harbor that's important. Pearl Harbor is sort of the catalyst. It's this moment that leads to a couple months later, President Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, which eventually created a military zone on the west coast of the United States, as we saw on that map, that turned it over to the military. So Secretary of War Henry Stimson could do whatever he thought was necessary to keep that area safe. We have to remember there was a fear around an attack, another attack or an invasion of the West Coast. And so Executive Order 9066 led to the creation of these exclusion orders that ultimately led to the removal and incarceration of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast.
Okay, so let's sit with this just for 1 second now. So executive order is announced. Not long thereafter, the evacuation orders are issued.
Yes.
So from that time, roughly 10 days or so have passed for all residents of Japanese ancestry to get all their affairs in order, right? To go to a place and they don't know where that place is going to be or when they'll return, and not know if they're going to be returning to homes or jobs. So just want to make sure we understand, everybody who's in their classrooms understands exactly what was happening at this moment in time. Right,
and you see these signs go up around, neighborhoods. So imagine walking home from school and seeing on a telephone post or the side of a building, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, but put a descriptor in there that fits for you, that would make you go over to that sign to read what those instructions are. And you would see that you had about 10 days at most, usually closer to a week, to pack everything up and leave your friends, leave your school, leave your pets often. That's the situation that Japanese Americans found themselves in.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look at the next poll question. True or false? People of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii were sent to incarceration camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Vote now and we'll reveal the answer when we return. Now back to you, Cavell and Rio.
My grandmother was a girl when she heard about Pearl Harbor. What do you remember about the day you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Pearl Harbor Day was on a Sunday, and I came home from Sunday school, and my parents and my older siblings were listening to the radio, and everybody was really tense and shocked because nobody expected that Japan would bomb any part of the U.S. I think they were worried too, especially my parents, because they were not able to be U.S. citizens at that point, and so they were worried that as Japanese citizens, they would be targeted by the U.S. government.
How did life change after that, like at home or at school or in the neighborhood?
The first thing that happened that I became aware of is the FBI visited Japanese American homes and arrested people that they thought would be enemies of the U.S. My father had a bag packed, a leather bag packed with things that he could take if the FBI came after him. And sometimes they came like in the middle of the night, so like I would go to bed, my father would be there, but the first thing in the morning, my father would already be gone to work, and I would go to the door and see whether his bag was still there.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This authorized the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans and their families on the West Coast and Arizona. Issei lost their jobs, businesses, and farms. Nisei left pets, friends, and schools behind. Everyone wondered, will we return home again? So what did your family take to camp, and what did they have to leave behind?
Well, in terms of what they took, as I said, it was only things that we could carry. So they made the decisions about what to take. As a 6-year-old, I wasn't in a position to make big decisions, but I do remember thinking that I was really going to miss my swing set that was in the back.
What did it feel like to leave home?
It was scary. I was 6 years old. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. When we were being picked up by the bus, we all gathered. I think it must have been like at the park someplace, because we were on a large grassy area, and we all lined up by family, and each family member was given a tag that had our name and our number on it. We lined up with the oldest member at the beginning of the line and the youngest at the end, and so my father was at the head of the line, I was at the end, and I remember wishing that I could be next to my father and mother rather than at the end of the line.
My family was taken to Pomona Temporary Detention Facility, 30 miles away in Pomona, California. Euphemistically called the Pomona Assembly Center, Pomona was one of the 15 racetracks and fairgrounds hastily transformed into temporary detention facilities.
While Emily's family was in Pomona, Walter's family was imprisoned at the Fresno Temporary Detention Facility 200 miles away in Central California. In interviews with the museum, Walter recalls leaving home for Fresno.
Before we left for camp, my sister May, she printed all these things with my father's instruction. James M. Imahara, Sacramento, his bag, this second bag we have, 8663 was our number. So everything that we have, we had to carry a little bag, tag, 8663. When I went to camp, maybe I was 4 years old. Okay, but so the life before camp was really nice. Now we got into camp. We started off in Fresno Assembly Center. A lot of the people went into these horse stables. They just left their nice home overnight in a horse stable. So there was a lot of bad feelings. My father especially had he was very angry at United States because he lost everything at the age of 37 and had 8 children. His dream was broken overnight. Okay, but he understood why we had to go into camp, but he had a feeling was not too good. And he was a Buddhist, like my mother was Buddhist. And if their teaching was still behind him, because once he got out of camp, the attitude did change. And I mean, he became a strong American.
Now, let's take a look at some artifacts to learn more about what happened in neighborhoods, towns, and cities across the western United States. Here is the 1942 yearbook of Aviator, the pilot, from Excelsior Union High School in Artesia, California. How did this become part of the museum's digital learning project? See you next year, high school yearbooks from World War II.
When we had the idea for See You Next Year, high school yearbooks from World War II, we wanted to have a representative yearbook, we hoped, from every state in the Union, 48 at that time. We collected them through donations from people wanting to give them to the museum, and we had this one along with many other yearbooks from California. But it was not until we looked inside it that we saw why this yearbook was so special and why we wanted to feature it in our See You Next Year High School Yearbooks of World War II Digital Learning Project.
What aspects of the war are shown in this yearbook?
So this yearbook's from 1942. So just like now, most yearbooks are published in the springtime when the school term is ending. So by the time this yearbook was published, the United States had only been at war for about 6 months. So there's not a ton of war-related content in here. You see some patriotic appeals to buy war bonds and war stamps, collect scrap metal, things like that. But there's one page specifically that touches on an aspect of the war coming home to this community. And it's on a single page where we see students of the Japanese club gathered for a photo. And in the write-up and description of the Japanese club, we see a line where it says, before their necessary departure, the members of the Japanese club had a party. So necessary departure. That's this student body trying to come to terms with what was happening to their teammates, their classmates, their friends, people who they'd grown up with, suddenly uprooted and banished from their lives in this necessary departure, as it's described in the pages of the El Aviador.
What are some things primary sources like yearbooks cannot speak to or tell us?
Yearbooks like this are great for giving you a snapshot of 1 year in the life of a student body. You'll have typical things we see in yearbooks today, prom royalty, sports, clubs, honorariums, honorifics, but you really don't get much outside of that 1 year. This is a snapshot of 1 year in the life of a student body. It's a kind of micro-history. You can see large events represented in it. Like we said, we see the war intrude a little bit, but if we really wanted to get a fuller picture of the impact of World War II on students during the 1940s, we could look to other yearbooks in our collection from 1943, 44, and 45.
All right, great job, everyone. Now, let's find out who knew the answer to our last poll question. A reminder, people of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii were sent to incarceration camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor. True or false? The answer is false. The roughly 150,000 people of Japanese descent living in Hawaii were not removed from their homes. Aaron, what makes a story on Hawaii different from the U.S. mainland?
Sure. So on Hawaii, Japanese Americans were almost 40% of the population. And so even though the attack on Pearl Harbor happened on Hawaii, there wasn't the same sort of mass roundup and removal and incarceration for a couple of reasons. One, because they were such a large portion of the population, removing Japanese Americans from Hawaii would have collapsed the economy, and there was need for, war support work to happen on Hawaii. Also, logistically, it would have been very difficult to remove that many people from the islands into the interior of the country, and also very expensive. So for the most part, Japanese Americans on Hawaii remained there. However, there was martial law in place, so it wasn't, this peachy, great place to be if you were a Japanese American. There was still the sort of fear and anger and suspicion, and community leaders were rounded up as they were along the West Coast after Pearl Harbor, after December 7th, and placed in internment camps and incarceration centers on the islands, and some of them were eventually moved to the interior of the country as well.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's take a few more student questions.
My name is Isla, and my question is, what was the medical care like, and especially for women that were incarcerated in the camps?
Thanks for that question, Isla. It's a good one. So like many other things at camp, when Japanese Americans first arrived, there was a huge shortage. They were trying to have about one doctor per 1,000 people, but during the war, for a lot of reasons, there was a shortage of doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. Also, in a lot of states where the camps were located, doctors did not want to interact with Japanese American populations. They didn't want to be part of the work happening by the War Relocation Authority. So eventually, Japanese American doctors and nurses were also put to work assisting white doctors who were working in the camp. So in the beginning, there was a lot of, health issues. Folks had been moved from largely temperate climates along the West Coast and put in, high desert, so tons of dust, cold temperatures, really hot temperatures. So that led to things like asthma. Food was really poor in the beginning of camp, which you'll hear a lot about if you talk to folks who were incarcerated. And so there were just sort of the normal food poisoning things that happened, and stomach issues. There were tuberculosis outbreaks. So a lot of, health issues that happened that would normally happen among a population like this, but made, aggravated even further by the lack of health care and appropriate facilities. For women in particular, these issues affected women as well. Young mothers trying to feed their children, that was difficult at first to come by milk and other kinds of nutrient foods that you need to nutritious foods you need to, feed young growing children. And there were a lot of babies born in camp. So that was something that, developed over the course of time to have appropriate facilities, et cetera. But that was, I think, probably one of the biggest health questions and issues that women faced when they were in camp.
Thank you. Great question, Isla. We have another student question from Kimberly.
Hi, my name is Kimberly, and I go to TSD, Tennessee School for the Deaf. And I need to ask you a question. What job did Japanese Americans do during the camp stuff?
Another great question. So there were all kinds of jobs in camp. It's important to remember that these places were basically small cities, and eventually they ran almost entirely without outside help. So as I mentioned in the previous question, there were doctors and nurses, there were teachers, there were, folks who eventually became farmers, both in camp and outside of camp would leave to help farms in the area because there was a really severe labor shortage during World War II. So folks had all kinds of jobs, some that were, similar to what they had done on the outside, and some that were entirely new and required new skills and new things like that.
Yeah, great. Yeah. All right, now it's time for our next poll question. True or false, incarcerees could only take what they could carry with them? We'll reveal your answers after the next segment. Back to you, Rio and Cavell.
Heart Mountain was one of the 10 camps built by the War Relocation Authority in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. The WRA called these camps relocation centers, a euphemistic term suggesting images of peaceful and rustic summer camps. The reality was that incarcerees lived in drafty tar paper barracks. There was no privacy in the mess halls, communal bathrooms, or barracks. Heart Mountain sat on 46,000 acres of land owned by the Bureau of Reclamation. Originally part of the Crow Nation's homelands, this area spanned between Cody and Powell, Wyoming. Surrounded by barbed wire and 9 guard towers, the camp spanned 740 acres. It had 650 buildings, including mess halls, communal bathrooms, laundry buildings, and 450 tar paper barracks. It held 10,767 incarcerees from Los Angeles, Santa Clara, San Francisco, and Yakima Valley. At the time, it was considered the 3rd largest town in Wyoming. The first incarcerees arrived at the camp on August 12, 1942. When they walked into the barracks, they saw an overhead light, a stove, and army cots. They stuffed newspapers and rags into cracks and knotholes to keep dust and harsh weather out. They made their own furniture from scrap lumber and used sheets to create some privacy. My grandmother was 7 years old when she stepped foot into camp during the first week of September 1942. What memories do you have about arriving at Heart Mountain?
Well, it was disappointing because this was going to be our permanent home, and we were all prepared Like my family bought camp chairs with canvas seats and lined, colorful lined seats on them, because they were things we could fold up and carry. And the idea that camp was going to kind of be like a rustic, quiet, calm place to go to. Well, it wasn't. It turned out to be there was no foliage. It was all tumbleweeds and a lot of dust flying around. And our house was one room with 6 cots and a pot-belly stove that we could use to keep us warm. It had no partitions, so my mother had to put up sheets as partitions if we wanted the sleep area to be separate from the living area. No bathrooms there. We had to go away for the bathrooms. No food preparation there. We had to go away for meals, except we did use the top of the pot-belly stoves sometimes. The only water we had was like one sink with faucets, so it was not very appealing. Well, I learned about gamang in camp, because if we wanted to be good children, we were not allowed to have a tantrum or kick and scream and act nasty to our parents or anything like that, because everybody could hear us next door. And the favorite social activity in camp was gossip. So that would mean if you were acting bad, everybody would find out about it.
While Amy's family was in Wyoming, Walter's family was imprisoned in the Jerome and Royer camps in Arkansas. Originally part of the Osage and Quapaw Nation's homelands, the swamplands they were built on were owned by the Foreign Security Administration before being purchased by the WRA in 1942. 8,497 incarcerees from Hawaii, Los Angeles, Fresno, and Sacramento lived in 432 barracks.
It was a concentration camp. Had barbed wire, and it was had towers all over, machine guns sitting up there. And I know my parents said stay away from the barbed wire fence. But as a child, you go over there and you hold the barbed wire and you're looking out. Of course, no one did anything about it. But I know that my parents, when we got to Jerome, okay, it was in the middle of the swampland, next to the Mississippi River, and it was land that no one wanted. It was so bad. Okay, and they squared it off. And my parents was my father especially was very angry, like all the men folks, because we were told we were there for our protection. They all looked up, but the machine guns were pointing in. Okay, all of a sudden they got the bad feeling. Now they knew they were in a concentration camp.
Creating an education system was crucial at all 10 camps. At Heart Mountain, school had a rocky start on October 5th, 1942. Barracks substituted for classrooms weren't equipped with enough supplies, furniture, or heating to create a comfortable learning environment. Students sat on benches. Teachers used boxes for desks. Sheets of black painted plywood stood in for chalkboards. Classes were noisy. Books were in short supply, and students checked them out to finish their homework. But it got better when Heart Mountain High School was completed on May 27, 1943. The new school was equipped with classrooms, a gymnasium, library, home economics room, machine shop, and wood shop. It hosted dances and athletic events. It also published the student newspaper and yearbook, the Heart Mountain Eagle and the Tempo. What do you remember about going to school in camp?
You know, school was for me a lot of fun and really positive. And I feel very fortunate because I know that didn't happen for everybody. But I had 3 teachers, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. I remember them in very fond ways. Like my 2nd grade teacher, I think one day after lunch, she said to everybody in the class, she says, I have an announcement to make. Amy is going to be promoted from the 2nd reading group to the top group, the third group. And it was the first time anybody had really praised me for doing something academically. And I remember how good it made me feel. So I'm sure that really helped me to move on in school.
Outside of school, students ice skated, swam, and participated in scouting and art classes. They also went to movie theaters, sports events, and cultural celebrations. Food was another issue. Although Heart Mountain received shipments from Colorado and Kansas, it wasn't fresh and didn't include ingredients found in Japanese food. They craved fresh fruit, vegetables, and white rice. They got hot dogs, bread, potatoes, canned fruit, and vegetables. What do you remember about the food when you first got to Heart Mountain?
The food was pretty grim. When we were first there, we had to stand in long lines just to get into the mess hall. And the mess hall had long tables, and we would go through this line and pick up our food on trays and bring it to the table. And the food was kind of like not too tasty cafeteria food. It was American food. It was not food that we were used to.
When the media and politicians spread rumors that incarcerees were not subject to food rationing and suggested halting food shipments in 1943, Heart Mountain created an agricultural department to provide incarcerees with fresh food. They grew 52 types of vegetables, including daikon and napa cabbage, which is used in traditional Japanese food. They farmed 1,400 acres of land and harvested about 2,069,735 pounds of produce. How did the food and dishes change after the camp started doing its own farming?
We had the type of vegetables that Japanese like to eat. And so the cooks who were Japanese Americans who were living there were able to make food that was really much more appealing.
Jerome and Royer also had difficulty establishing schools for students. In interviews with the museum, Walter and Maharo recalled school and recreational activities for students and the food situation in camp.
6 years old, and my mother says, I need to go to school in camp. I said, no, I really don't want to. And she took me by the hand, and she took me to first grade. And at recess, I said, I don't like this school. And I ran back. I beat her back to the barracks, you know. So next day, took me back by hand, and this time I stayed in school. I'm always asked, how did you feel about living in camp as a youngster? I said, oh, we had a lot of fun. We go play baseball, okay, and we go eat with our kids' friends and all that. See, 'cause we had nothing to get upset about, huh? As a parents, they're really hard on their life.
Let's turn to the museum's artifacts to discover what school was like at Royer. Here is a resume, the 1944 yearbook from the Royer Center High School. What was the unique aspects of this yearbook?
In the Royer yearbook, you see high school students trying to make normalcy out of very abnormal conditions. So intermixed with sports and clubs, you see how they're living. Tar paper shacks, all together, no privacy. Social and family life must have suffered greatly. But again, these students trying to recreate parts of their lives that were taken from them.
Great job reporting, Rio and Cavell. We've heard so much about life at Heart Mountain, Jerome, and Royer, and I just loved hearing Amy's story about the joy she felt when she got promoted in third grade. That was fantastic. All right, now let's reveal the answer to the third poll question. True or false, incarcerees could only take what they could carry with them. The answer is true. And we even saw that Walter still has one of his family's bags in his collection. Aaron, can you tell us a bit about your family's experience inside of camp?
Sure. So my grandmother, Misa, was 20 years old when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So she was just about to start nursing school. I actually don't know very much about my grandmother's life in camp. She, like many Japanese American elders, never talked about it for I'm sure, many different reasons. So what I've been able to learn about my family's time incarcerated at Hart Mountain is what I've been able to, ask other elders in my family about, or learn from the archives, or doing research in the yearbooks like what Colin has shown us. So one of the sort of stories that I find most interesting about my grandmother is that she volunteered to take the very first train from Pomona, the temporary detention center where she went to first with her older brother, out to Hart Mountain. So she arrived at Hart Mountain on August 12th of 1942, and she was one of several hundred Japanese Americans who volunteered to take that train from Southern California to the northwest corner of Wyoming to help set up the camp. So I'm guessing because she was about to start nursing school, she helped set up the hospital. But other folks went out there to finish construction, to finish building the barracks that families would live in, or to finish setting up the mess hall or the hospital. Most of the camps were still under construction when Japanese Americans arrived, but there was this sort of vanguard group that my grandmother was in that helped really get things ready and be sort of the welcoming committee. And I love that story, even though I never got to ask my grandmother about it, because it says so much about her that she would volunteer. Maybe she just wanted to leave Pomona and the terrible circumstances there, but also that she felt this sort of way that she could be useful and helpful to other families in the same situation.
Right, so there was such a strong sense of resourcefulness and almost interdependence. As I shared
Absolutely.
earlier, my father was born in the Gila River camp in the desert in Arizona.
Right.
And you talked earlier about sort of the malnourishment and the lack of proper diet, and my grandmother actually delivered my father Rod while in camp. And her milk actually didn't come in time for him to be properly nourished. So in this sense of interdependence, they all had to sort of pull resources together to make sure that my father would be fed. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, now let's turn to some student questions.
Hi, I'm Isabel Fujita.
And I'm Delilah Fujita.
Hi, Dad.
So because Grandpa was born in a Japanese internment camp in Rivers, Arizona, we have a couple questions for you.
First, we were wondering what activities did they do to pass the time? How did they spend their time on a day-to-day basis? We're also wondering what struggles did they face living in the internment camps?
So after they left the internment camps, what was it like for them to build a new life? Were there any challenges they had to face?
Thank you. Have a safe trip home.
All right, great questions,
great.
you two. Really good questions. All right, so I guess first of all, what was it like in camp? For my grandmother, like I just spoke about, I think just the sense of raising a child in camp and delivering a child while her husband is overseas, that was probably quite difficult for her. But one of the things she did was, she had an itch to become a teacher. So I think she took advantage of an opportunity in camp to hone her teaching craft, became a teacher while in camp. There is this notion, which I'm sure you're familiar with within Japanese culture, and the phrase is shikata ganai, which loosely translated means it cannot be changed or it is what it is, so make the best of the situation. So my understanding is folks just found a way to make the best of the situation. In terms of Delilah's question about what it was like after camp, probably pretty complicated. You're returning home now to what? Some folks didn't have any of their personal belongings, returned to no longer having a home to move back into. So from my grandparents' perspective, they returned to Berkeley where they were able to continue their education. And my grandfather wanted to become an attorney, so he finished up law school at the Bolt School of Law in Berkeley. But people's lives were flipped upside down when they were evacuated and incarcerated, and essentially had to start all over again. Great questions, guys. Okay, now we have one live question. All right, this is from Nicholas and Connor. Did Japanese Americans on the East Coast get uprooted and sent to camps? Great question, Erin.
That is a great question. Thanks, Nicholas and Connor. So for the most part, no. As you saw on that map, the exclusion zone was just the West Coast. So that is where the majority of Japanese Americans living in the continental United States were. And so while there were Japanese Americans in places like New York City and elsewhere, the way that communities spread out, not everyone was in one place, but the vast majority of Japanese Americans were on the West Coast. And so most of the folks on the East Coast did not go to camp. There are a couple stories of folks who volunteered to go to camp or went to go join family members. There's one particular artist, Isamu Noguchi, who asked to go to camp so he could sort of be part of this experience and create some art. He only lasted for a short period of time before he left. But no, for the most part, Japanese Americans who were on the East Coast were able to stay, though it was wartime and they, looked like the enemy, that sort of famous phrase. So I think we can imagine perhaps what that experience was like for them.
Great questions. All right, now let's look at the next poll question. So, what do you think the 442nd Regimental Combat Team's motto, "Go for broke," means? A, strong and prepared. B, risking everything to win. C, protect and provide. or D, making the ultimate sacrifice? Vote now and we'll reveal your answer when we return. Back to you, Rio.
While Japanese Americans were incarcerated, the U.S. classified draft-eligible Nisei men as 4C, enemy aliens, barring them from entering military service. In early 1943, the 4C classification was reversed, and President Roosevelt established a racially segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team on February 1, 1943. That same month, the U.S. military came to Heart Mountain to distribute the loyalty questionnaire. What do you remember about the other incarcerees' reaction to the questionnaire?
The loyalty questionnaire was really a divisive thing. It was supposedly set up by people by the government to sort out who was loyal to the U.S. and who was more committed to Japan. But the people who put together the question didn't understand a lot of the subtleties that such a question would bring up. There was a lot of controversy about what you answered. And unfortunately, instead of everybody understanding that we were in a tenable position, it was like no matter what we answered, it would be bad in a certain way. It would be good for others in a certain way.
While incarcerees filled out the questionnaire, Kiyoshi Okamoto called for clarification of Nisei's rights before they completed it. Nisei, like Frank Emi and Paul Nakadate, sought him out to talk about the illegality of incarceration, constitutional law, and strategies for restoring their rights. When the U.S. government announced that Nisei men were eligible for the draft in January of 1944, they formed the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee. Members were loyal U.S. citizens willing to serve the Army if their legal rights were restored. But at the end of March, U.S. Marshals arrested members, charged them with draft resistance, and imprisoned them in local jails. By June of 1944, 63 Nisei men were tried in a mass trial in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Despite the resistance movement at Heart Mountain, over 700 young men reported for their physicals, and 385 of them were inducted into the U.S. Army directly from that camp. Over 800 Heart Mountain incarcerees served in the military and were part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. 15 were killed in battle and 2 received the Medal of Honor. What do you remember about people's attitudes towards the 442nd soldiers and the draft resistors?
I think it kind of broke up into a similar thing with the loyalty oath. It broke up into people who were kind of going along with what the government wanted, and then the group that were resistors, the group that was saying, what you're asking of us is not American. We are willing to fight for the U.S. government if you let our families free.
What memories do you have about your brothers going to war?
Well, my brothers were drafted and were part of the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, which meant that they got special training. They already knew Japanese, but they got special training so that they could translate military documents and talk Japanese very fluently. My brother, Nels, my older brother, was sent to the Philippines, and his job was to interview prisoners of war from Japan. My brother, Shogo, the second one, was stationed with MacArthur in Tokyo, and he was part of translating the war trials in Japan.
And we are back at the World War II Museum and have learned so much about how incarcerees stood up for their rights and fought for their country. Now let's take a look at the answer to the fourth poll question. What do you think the 442nd Regimental Combat Team's motto, "Go for broke," means? Strong and prepared, risking everything to win, protect and provide, or making the ultimate sacrifice? The answer is B. Yes, it was a gambling term, meaning risking everything to win. Now, Aaron, both of our grandfathers served in the 442nd. Tell me a bit about your grandpa's service in the 442nd and just the distinguished service of the 442nd's history.
Absolutely. So, yes, my grandfather, Chikara, grew up on Maui in Hawaii on a pineapple plantation. And actually worked as a carpenter at Pearl Harbor, at the base. And so my auntie says they were so relieved that the bombing happened on a Sunday because my grandfather wasn't at work. So even though he, possibly wanted to volunteer or enlist in the military after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were moved to be classified as 4C or 4F, which meant basically unfit to serve. So my grandfather wasn't able to enlist until 1943. And he served in the 442nd, which was the segregated unit that was the most decorated military unit for its size and length of service. And my grandfather trained at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where the 442nd trained. And actually, he was someone who enlisted from Hawaii. He was never incarcerated. Your grandfather volunteered from within an incarceration camp. So these two groups of Japanese Americans were very unique and different from each other. Japanese Americans from Hawaii were used to living around a lot of other Japanese Americans. They were basically a majority population in Hawaii. They were there with Japanese Americans who had volunteered out of camps, who were leaving behind their families, who were living in prisons to serve their country. And so there was this tension between these two groups. They didn't see eye to eye on a lot. They didn't get along. And so it took, educating the Japanese Americans from Hawaii about the circumstances that folks like your grandfather had volunteered out of that really sort of cemented this unit as a team. And the 100th Battalion, which was nestled within the 442nd, is actually nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion because of their service, because of how much, how brave they were, how they were sent in to rescue other units in the military as well. But my grandfather was a kid. He was 19, 20 years old when he enlisted and fought in Italy and France and was horribly wounded and came back to recover in the United States. But this is something that we're proud of in my family, that he served. But also that, he was coming from a very different circumstance than your grandfather.
Yeah, when you think about that sense of duty and patriotism and sense of service, when so many of your fellow Japanese Americans have been forcibly removed from their homes and now are incarcerated, to really step up and answer the bell and go out and sort of demonstrate your sense of duty and patriotism. It's fascinating, and I'm proud of it, and also angered by it. I think it's natural to feel that sort of deep sense of personal connection to it, and recognizing that just that sacrifice was made and all that went into a decision like that. Maybe spend 1 second talking about sort of, this go for broke mantra, and I've always struggled with this, sort of the juxtaposition of that versus this notion of shikata ganai, which I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. They seem like competing ideologies, but maybe they actually work quite well together. Again, it's making the best of a tough situation. Maybe one way in doing so is to show your sense of duty and patriotism.
I think so, and I think there was this element of needing to prove themselves, whether they were Japanese Americans from Hawaii who were sort of trying to prove that they were full Americans, that they didn't deserve to be the object of suspicion and fear. And then I think for Japanese Americans like your grandfather who volunteered out of camp, the sort of heartbreaking desire to prove that you were fully American, that you were willing to give your life despite the fact that your family was in this incredibly unjust situation. I think that's for me where shikata ganai and the go for broke kind of come together to this incredible demonstration of bravery, and I think a desire to do something different with their lives after the war and sort of have this impact on the war and on the United States and prove their loyalty, prove their Americanism, and also sort of join the rest of society as well.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a lot of great questions coming in live. If we can't get to them all, please keep them coming. You can get those questions answered by our experts who are standing by on Twitter at #JAEFT. But for now, let's go to another video question.
My question is, what is your definition of the American dream, and how do you think it has affected people differently through the years?
That is a great question. That's a loaded question in a lot of ways. I think for me, as a historian and as someone who studies Japanese American history in particular, and the history and sort of legacy and memory of incarceration, For me, the American dream is this sort of belief in possibility, the belief that things can get better. And I don't mean that as sort of the bootstraps American dream that maybe a lot of us have grown up with. You know, if you work really hard, you can get ahead. I think the history of Japanese American incarceration shows us that sometimes there are factors outside of your control. There's racism, there's prejudice, that sort of make that bootstraps narrative just unrealistic for so many folks. And so for me, I think the American dream is believing in the possibility of democracy and these ideals that serve as the foundation of our nation that we haven't quite achieved, but that we can continue working towards. I think that's where I see hope, and I find the value of studying history to sort of see how we can keep moving closer.
Great answer and great question. All right, one more question that just came in live. This is from Anne. Were people in the camps allowed to practice their religion within the incarceration camp?
That's a great question, Anne. And yes, Japanese Americans were a whole range of religion. I think, you know, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a lot of Buddhist and Shinto priests, which were sort of more traditional Japanese American religions, were rounded up and sent to those army-run internment camps and often separated from their families. So there was a lot of perhaps particular suspicion around Buddhism and Shintoism, but within camp, incarcerees were able to form churches. Many folks had, you know, altars within their barrack apartments and things like that. So religion was a very important part of camp, even to sort of form communities within the larger towns, basically, that these prison camps were.
Yeah, great question, Anne. All right, now in our final segment, we'll discover how they fought for redress and reparations with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and how the camps are remembered today. Now it's time for the final poll question of the day. What event led to many of the incarceration camps permanently closing? A, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. B, the surrender of Germany. C, a Supreme Court ruling. Or D, the signing of an executive order. Vote now and we'll reveal the answer when we return. Now wrapping up our story are Rio and Cavell.
The first incarcerees left Hart Mountain for the West Coast in January of 1945. The camp closed on November 10th, 1945, when the last train of incarcerees left Wyoming. What was it like leaving Hart Mountain, and what did you take with you?
I do remember two experiences with racism that made me very aware that going back home didn't necessarily mean that I was going to be free of racism. One happened when we stopped on the train trip back to Los Angeles. We stopped there for lunch, and my mother and a few of her friends we were all going together to a restaurant. And as we approached the restaurant, I could see a sign that said, "No Japs allowed." And not only the sign, but I still remember the look of hatred in the eyes of the man and the woman who was standing outside their restaurant like this. So that was a pretty powerful experience for me. I'm thinking of the times when I've been really affected by racism. When you see people's eyes and you see the hatred in their eyes, it's pretty powerful.
How have your camp experiences affected you throughout your life?
Well, I think it had a very profound effect because I realized how great a part racism has played in my life. And it's had all kinds of ramifications then in terms of how I relate to other people who experience racism, how I live in a country that has the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag that really promises a good life for all of us in an equal way. How do I live with those values and the reality of what our country is like? It's a far-reaching problem.
In 1980, Congress and President Carter approved the creation of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. They gathered archival sources, scholarship, and personal papers that explain the government's decision and process for incarceration. The commissions also held 20 days of hearings. On August 6, 1981, my grandmother testified at the Los Angeles hearings as a member of the mental health panel.
I remembered the guard towers, the soldiers with their guns pointed into us. Weren't they there? Weren't they supposed to be protecting us from all the potentially dangerous, hostile people outside? I remembered the hatred in the eyes of the man and the woman who ran a restaurant in Butte, Montana. My mother and her friends tried to enter the restaurant during a train stop as we were on the return trip home from camp. The East Bay ladies did not read the No Japs Allowed sign that was in the window. By then, I was 10. I could read, and I herded the ladies away from the restaurant. I remembered feeling bad about being Japanese, of being even able to speak Japanese, of having Japanese parents. I felt ashamed because I loved my parents. I also loved America. I get goosebumps when I sing the Star-Spangled Banner. I believed what our teachers taught us about what a great country America is.
What made you decide to testify during the hearings?
It was interesting because it was not something that was popular among everybody. And I guess the fact that I had been talking to my students, to my patients, and reading about other people's experiences with the camp experience, I knew what a profound effect it had on all of us. And so I knew it was something that was important to talk about, even though it wasn't popular to talk about it.
On February 24, 1983, the Commission issued its report, Personal Justice Denied. It concluded that the promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 into law on August 10, 1988. Issuing a presidential apology to every living incarceree and $20,000 in reparations. You can still see the barracks that dot the landscape on the drive to the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation's Interpretive Center. The museum opened in 2011 and sits on the original site of the camp. It features artifacts, stories, and special exhibits about Heart Mountain and hosts the annual Heart Mountain pilgrimage. We had our family reunion during the 2016 pilgrimage. When did you first return to Heart Mountain?
Well, when I actually first returned to Heart Mountain was when I was maybe in my early 30s, and I didn't mind the fact, I didn't miss the fact that the camp was not there. I didn't miss the barracks not being there and all the different things that were part of the camp. But I was very moved by the fact that Heart Mountain was still there, that this mountain, this very large, strong mountain was still there. But when I saw Heart Mountain, it brought tears to my eyes and joy to my heart, because I really saw Heart Mountain as the mountain that I could turn to for protection and comfort.
The Royer Camp closed on November 30, 1945, 20 days after the closing of Heart Mountain. In 2013, the World War II Japanese American Internment Museum opened in McGee, Arkansas. It features the histories of both camps and is in between the original sites. Today, these museums and sites in Wyoming and Arkansas are places of immersive history. By walking the same grounds that Japanese Americans did over 75 years ago and reflecting on the complexities of our own family histories, we can gain a better understanding of the present and begin to heal.
Wow, huge thanks to Amy, Rio, Cavell, and Colin for their fantastic reporting and storytelling on this journey. Now let's take a look at the answer to the final poll question. What event led to many of the incarceration camps permanently closing? The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a Supreme Court ruling, or the signing of an executive order? The answer is C. In the case of Mitsuyo Endo, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously in 1944 that the government could not confine citizens of Japanese ancestry who were conceitedly loyal. Aaron, was this the only major court case, or were there others?
That's a great question, and there's more than I have time to go into right now. So I'll encourage all of you to keep learning, to use the museum's resources, to use resources like Densho, Encyclopedia. But no, Endo was the fourth kind of major Supreme Court case here. The first three, Yasui, Hirabayashi, and Korematsu, were challenges to the curfew and exclusion orders, which were found constitutional. Those three men were sent to prison, eventually to camp in some cases. Endo was challenging the constitutionality of the incarceration itself, of detaining, imprisoning American citizens in these camps. And Endo was chosen very specifically. She was Methodist. She had never been to Japan. She'd been an employee for the state of California. She was sort of this great example of Japanese Americans as, you know, American citizens to prove their patriotism.
Great. Well, Aaron, I know we're running out of time, but I have one final question for you.
Yes.
Is there anything students can do to ensure that this period in history is never forgotten?
Absolutely. A great question to end on. I think the fact that you're all here at this electronic field trip is huge. Please take what you've learned and share with your friends, with your parents, with your siblings, neighbors, grandparents, anyone. Continue asking questions. If you want to get involved in, you know, the process of really remembering this history, most communities that have Japanese Americans or that are nearby to sites where Japanese Americans were incarcerated or removed from have what's called Day of Remembrance celebrations, where they mark February 19th, the day that President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So often there's programming, much of it's online, you'll hear speeches, poems, just sort of a way to actively remember and think about how we use this past to inform our present. Another thing I'll say is just to talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, talk to elders in your communities, hear their stories to understand how you got to be where you are and who you are, whether you're Japanese American or not. The more that we know about our own histories, I think the better people, friends, family members, community members that we can be.
Yep, storytelling. It's so important. Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for your insights and for answering all of our students' questions. Now, we also want to thank all of our filming partners, including the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and Inflicted Media. We also want to give a special shout out to Walter Imahara, who this weekend will win the Alumni of the Year Award at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Cheers and congrats to Walter. Now, this program would not be possible without funding in part from the U.S. Department of the Interior, National Park Service, Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program. Support also provided by the Dale E. and Janice Davis Johnston Family Foundation. Teachers, if you're looking for even more curricular materials, be sure to visit the museum's Flipgrid page for mini documentaries on this topic created by the talented students at Capitol High School and Boise Senior High School in Idaho. These students put in countless hours of researching, writing, and media production into these videos for our viewers to learn from and enjoy. So please be sure to check them out. You can tell us your thoughts about the program by filling out the survey below. Now here we are live from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, along with museum expert Aaron Aoyama. Thank you all for watching.